Hi, Erin here. The other day I wrote a post about what constitutes a typical writer. I didn't come to any sort of conclusions, mostly because I don't think a typical writer actually exists. Our ideas of what a typical writer is or does is based on people who are long dead, and they probably didn't consider themselves to be typical writers either when they were writing. They were looking back to past writers too and realizing that they don't fit the writer mold or whatever you want to call it. The thing about my post is that it raised some interesting comments, and one of them was about the idea that writers may share certain qualities or characteristics that help them to be good writers or makes them good writers. I thought that was an interesting idea, so I started thinking of a list of what those qualities or characteristics might be. I actually limited myself to 5 because the list could quickly spiral out of control. I didn't include creativity or imagination because that seems self-evident in some ways. Writers need to be creative and imaginative. I also didn't include the idea that a writer is observant and is always watching what's going on around them. Writers do that, but I think that maybe that might tie into some of the other qualities that I did decide to list, and that actually will be posted in a future blog post, perhaps by the end of this week or sometime next week. It really depends on my publishing schedule. But the qualities I decided to think about were the writer's willingness to fail. And that one's huge for me because I'm a perfectionist, so that mentality is often in conflict with the writer one, which says, you know, you have to write and you have to fail and you have to have so many failures before you get some sort of success. That's just the way it is. Every single failed piece of writing eventually leads to the one that's decent or may qualify as being successful. Another idea is that writers have to be willing to try again, and they have to write despite failures and despite success. Both are dangerous. Failures can cause a writer to stop writing, just as success can. Both can, I guess, petrify the writer into not writing because they're afraid they won't be successful again, or they're afraid that their next writing is going to be just as much of a failure as the past one. Another idea I think that every good writer needs or follows is that writers read. You can't be a writer without reading. And Annie Dillard, who's probably one of my favorites, and I know I've mentioned her in previous videos, talks about reading books that you would like to write and writing books that you would like to read. And I agree with that idea, but I would add that writers need to read things that they don't necessarily like. Some of my best learned lessons from writing have been because I've been willing to read things that I either don't understand fully or that just don't really click with me in terms of style or maybe even subject matter. But by the time I finish reading that work, it's become one of my favorites. My favorite example actually is Emily Dickinson. I used to hate her poetry. It made absolutely no sense to me, and I hated to read it until I took a class in undergrad, and I spent some time just reading her poetry and understanding what she was accomplishing with just a dash and figuring that out. And now Emily Dickinson is one of my heroes, basically. I look to her for guidance when I'm thinking about using a dash rather than an end stop, or when I'm thinking about completing a thought and I have to ask myself, should I complete the thought or should I let silence reign? The other idea, and this closely ties into the reading, is that writers have to be able to think critically. They also have to be able to read critically, which relates to my whole Emily Dickinson example. And they have to be able to write critically. I think in order to hone one's skills as a writer, you have to read and think critically. It's not enough to just read for pure enjoyment. And I don't actually know that many writers do read for pure enjoyment. It's almost impossible. At least it is for me. It's very hard to turn off that little voice in my head that says, oh, that's a great line. I like how they broke the line. I like that word. I like the ideas, and I like how they're talking about those ideas. Those are things that I'm constantly thinking about when I'm reading, and I'm also making connections with other texts I've read, or I'm connecting things with my own ideas regarding writing or reading or just anything, really. Everything starts to mesh together in the wonderful world known as my brain. The final quality is that writers have to be able to accept criticism, and I think this is huge, and it also ties into the previous quality, being able to think critically. Criticism is going to happen, and some of it will be warranted, and some of it won't, and some of it will be good, and some of it will be bad, and some of it will be completely worthless. But a writer has to learn to accept that criticism and to accept it gracefully and not to become defensive or to attack the person offering the critique. It becomes a matter of hearing those criticisms and thinking about them and realizing that that person has a valid point in that particular area, but this other criticism has no relevance to me as a writer or to what I'm trying to accomplish with my writing. And so again, it comes back to thinking critically and being able to recognize when criticism is valid and when it isn't. And I think all those things start to work together. I don't know how to separate them anymore. I'm sure when I first started I was having to think very hard about thinking critically or trying to learn something, and now it's just a second nature. It's part of the qualities and characteristics that make me a writer. So I would actually love to hear from you about what you think makes a writer a good writer, what qualities and characteristics are necessary for that. And you can find me on my blog, or you can always tweet with me on Twitter. But just catch up with me and we will talk about what constitutes a good writer or what qualities and characteristics are necessary to being a good writer.